Bryan, I'm going to start with your high school because I read that you went to the same high school as the great Dan Jenkins, the great sports writer, Sports Illustrated, has written books, a legend. In what ways did that matter as your career got to where it goes? And we're going to get to how you got to where you are now, and obviously the whole point of this podcast is your start. But did that matter at all, and in what ways did it?
It was the biggest thing because it made a crazy career like sports writing and journalism seem doable. Like I didn't have any parents in the business or friends and, parents, friends in the business. And all of a sudden, here's this guy who, like I said, went to my high school, worked on the same high school newspaper, and then became the biggest sports writer on the planet. By that point, Dan, too, was living in Fort Worth. So I would look across a Luby's cafeteria and I would see him over there eating. And I'd be like, my mom would be like, why don't you just go talk to him? Why don't you introduce yourself? I was like, oh, I'm terrified of that guy. There's no way I'm going to do that. But yeah, it was huge.
And I also read that you had a dream of playing for the Texas Rangers, and then you kind of realized that might not work out. Kudos to you for having a real original sports writer origin story of wanting to play sports, realizing that wasn't going to happen. What I did want to ask you about, jumping ahead a little bit, is how did you decide, because it seems like from the get-go it's like a magazine track for you, that like magazines were kind of what piqued your interest. How did you go to that versus like the newspaper, the beat writer, columnist track?
Just to clarify, that Texas Rangers beautiful dream ended in second grade when I was benched or thereabouts. So this was not like, I got drafted, but I didn't work out in the minors. Just want to make they're very, very clear. I have absolutely no athletic talent. Magazine dream, I think that was probably more later on in college because I had just not done the college newspaper beat writing and things that would qualify me for a job at the Dallas Morning News. And also just the world was beginning to change. And you could just see when I was a kid, if you told me you'd be a columnist of the Morning News or the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, I thought that's it, man. That's the job. That's what I want to do forever. Write about the Cowboys, compete with Skip Bayless and Randy Galloway and those guys. That would have been it. I would have thought, that's awesome. Maybe someday get a sports radio shift at night, to add to your columnist bag there. But the world was changing a lot, and I was probably also just unqualified to be a beat writer, so my interest went in another direction.
I remember my 8th grade career paper, I wrote that I wanted to be the sports columnist of the Chicago Tribune. And thankfully, Chicago Tribune is one of the papers that still does have still today, 2025, good 25 years after I wrote that, still does have a full-time columnist. But it was, and you guys talk about this in your podcast a lot. There was a time, especially in those 80s, 90s, early 2000s, those were the celebrities.
They were.
But magazines too had this aura around it.
It's really hard to describe to people who didn't grow up in that time how anonymous so many journalists were. The person who was, and maybe different like at the Sun-Times or something like that, but at straight up broadsheets, the person who was the reporter on the Cowboys, the Rangers, the Bears, they were just kind of a byline for the most part. And there were a couple of people at the newspaper who got their picture in the paper. There were no podcasts, nothing like that. So if you wanted to be in that elect, and the elect was just people whose faces you recognized, right? Whose names were really blasted out there by the paper. That's just a tiny group of people.
Do you count the New Republic as like your first job?
Yeah, not in a living wage kind of way, but my entry into journalism. And I got that. I was at the University of Texas and I mailed a packet of clips. This tells you how ancient this is. I mailed a packet of clips to Washington, D.C. To apply for that job.
What were those clips? What were some of the things you were writing in college to kind of help get you in position for that?
I was writing columns for the Daily Texan, and these were like political columns or columns about the news of the day, which was like often a dean did something terrible that I can't even remember now. And yes, let's rush to the typewriter and make sure you remember what college journalism was like. Like every story was like, we've gone to war. Here we go. We must, something happened at a fraternity. So I was able to, in between those, write a few things about, this is 2000, the 2000 presidential primaries. I think I wrote an obit of Tom Landry in one of my columns and had just enough that was about, or I think George W. Bush was the governor of Texas at that time too. So he had what I thought was a very sluggish response to a tornado in Texas because he was off campaigning for president. And so enough things like that I could put them together and send them to a magazine in Washington and at least seem like a plausible person they might hire.
Do you remember how many different places you reached out to?
Probably less than a half dozen. And again, I found these in a book, I'm pretty sure. This sounds like, just like I wrote a Model T Ford to the interview, but it's pretty close to that now. Like there was a book about here are some great internships. And I opened it up and there was the New Republic. And I should note here for you that I didn't totally know what the New Republic was. Like I had read excerpts of it in political science classes. Like they would, a professor might copy a story and say, this is an interesting story that ran in that magazine. So I knew it was like a good magazine. But I remember when I went to do that interview in Washington and they flew me up there from Austin, I stole, let's use the right verb here, a couple of copies of it from the University of Texas Library and just put it in, they had the thing where they just stacked up all the recent ones and I took like the last 5 and put them in my backpack so that I would know what the New Republic was and essentially what they were trying to do. And I remember reading them on the plane, be like, this is good. This is some good stuff. I want to work at this place.
It reminds me, when I interviewed for my first job at Profile Weekly, I'll never forget the editor-in-chief asked me, had you heard of us before you got this interview? And like, in what ways? And I kind of and I had heard of them to answer his question directly, but the answer was yes. Had I been reading it, that I had to do some talking around. Similar to you, I remember pouring through a couple magazines before the interview.
Good interview question. More people should ask that one, employers. Have you heard of us?
Do you know what we do here?
Yeah. I don't know if I would have aced that one at the New Republic.
What were some of your responsibilities?
I was a reporter researcher, which was a very fancy way of saying fact checker.
I do love that they put that. I remember that was if you're a reporter or editor reporter, writer reporter, you just were a fact checker in those days.
Yeah, I think SI had a pretty similar title for youngins back then. But there was a lot of fact checking, which is incredibly valuable work because you just see how journalism's put together. It's one thing to read a finished, polished story. It's another thing to see the writer's rough version of it. And, sometimes facts are real facts and sometimes they're close enough. You got to see how people's brains work. You're like, is this that? Because I don't know about that. Can you show me your notebook on that one? So I did a lot of that and then just a lot of random office tasks and was trying desperately like everyone else there to try to get stories into the magazine. That was the reward for working for it. I think it was $300 a week was to try to get a couple of clips in and get your next job.
I do like to think that this podcast, part of it, because I'm hopeful that a lot of young people are listening who are trying to break in themselves and probably don't know a lot about certain things. Like, for example, a recent episode with Vinny Goodwill, he and I talked about what agate is for a few minutes. How would you kind of explain what fact checking, what that entailed? Because
I thought you were going to say, what is a magazine? But go ahead.
That too. Because I could tell you, Bryan, I was a fact checker. I had an internship as a fact checker at Sports Illustrated. And then when I got that first job, and I remember looking over my first assignment to edit, going to my editor and being like, oh, so do you want me to cross this out, highlight this, red pen this, check on this? And they're like, no, just go to Pro Football Reference and make sure it's good, and then I'll believe it's good. So, and I think a lot. So, what was fact checking back then? What did it entail?
It was not the quite, the New Yorker or New York Times Magazine full on. We're going to call the subjects and ask them, "Did you say this?" There was some sort of trust in the writer that they'd rendered the quotes correctly or quoted the person in context. But it was a lot of, go back and look up. Is this how you spell this person's name right? Did this bill in fact pass in this year? Was Bill Clinton in this year of his presidency when this thing happened? I mean, that was really what it was. And what you would also find, and I don't know if this was your experience as well, is that writers would basically often use 2 New York Times stories to get all their facts. Again, what we're talking about here at the New Republic is what we call a think piece, which, if we also needed to find that, it's essentially like a slightly buffed out column. It's something longer that puts an idea into the universe and then tries to prove the idea, and has a nice little fancy lead and a funny kicker on it. So these were a lot of think pieces, and often, again, the pool of facts, such as they were from a pretty tiny number of sources.
And to go back to your magazine days, when something goes in the magazine, you can't go into WordPress and fix it when it is wrong. So they did rely on the fact checkers.
It was important. And you had a deadline, a real deadline, that this whole giant beast that had political stories in the front and big culture essays in the back had to go to press. And so you just had to get it done. Like, again, it's funny with journalism now, certainly still happens and if stuff happens, you don't want to dally around a lot, but there was just a big final scary deadline that had to be met.
I called John Heyman once. He was SI baseball writer at the time, and I was a reporter intern, and I asked him there was a quote in there, and I was like, "How did you get that? I'm just trying to verify it." He goes, "I literally called the general manager of the Padres. That's how I got it." And I was like, "Oh, okay."
Checked.
Yes, that is good.
We're good.
That was a good
check mark.
A good lesson for me, but that was part of the job. You had to check everything that was a fact. You had to verify. So I want to talk about Slate, and I texted with you beforehand that thank you to Slate for having just all this archive. That there are still all of your stories now. Some of them 24 plus years old are still up there. How did you get that job at Slate?
Slate was sort of the New Republic in exile. So New Republic's a liberal magazine, and a former editor of the New Republic, Michael Kinsley, who's like one of the great geniuses of Washington journalism and journalism period, after leaving had gone on and said, I want to do something that's like the New Republic, that has, think pieces about politics and other subjects, but I want to do it online. This is going to be crazy. And he partnered with Microsoft, and this just all sounds so dated right now, but he partnered with Microsoft to create this. And Slate was, I think, 4 years old at this point and had a ton of smart people working at it. And it was kind of a very natural job. So I applied, they had somebody leave, and it was like a 9-month or year-long job. I can't remember what it was, the entry-level thing that I was getting. It actually paid a living wage, so I was very, very excited to do that. And that's what I did. And I went and interviewed with Jack Schaefer, who's a media columnist there and a great writer and now a great friend. And I got the job. It took a little while to convince them and for other people to convince them that I was the person to hire. But eventually I got it. And that was my first real job.
I was going through some of your stories. Like I wouldn't call Slate.com a blog, obviously, but
No.
There's a sense of like, well, let me just bring up, like, in just a mattering of months, I had you writing about Keith Olbermann. You were burning down the Baseball Hall of Fame. You wrote about Mel Kiper, NBA salary caps. And, I sent you a couple of clips that I found on newspapers.com too, that you had some things that would run in like the Star Ledger in New Jersey. They pull stuff from Slate, and you did play reviews, book reviews, movie reviews. I mean, it seems like you just had an open book a little bit. What was it like to kind of have that freedom? And how did you kind of figure out each day what it was going to be that you were going to write?
So there's two important things that happened at Slate. One was there was no hierarchy there in terms of age or experience. You go to a magazine, you say, I want to write a profile. I said, well, kid, there's a line of people that want to do that. Same thing in a newspaper. I want to cover the Bears. Well, this is not going to be your job right now. At Slate, they had this idea that, 23, 24-year-olds could write as long as they had a great idea. And it didn't really matter if it was politics or sports or pop culture, whatever it was. You just got to write it if you could do it. And again, it's like, this is just for context here, before snarky 24-year-olds at Gawker would rule the world. This was a very just different time. So the idea that you could work at a publication and do that was huge. And then as you point out, you could actually just do it about anything. So, I had responsibilities there to like do our aggregation, things like that, and edit certain parts of the site. But then in my spare time, I would just pitch stories. I would just come up with things and often, the old truism, right? Write what you know. Well, what did I know? Well, I'd been a kid who was just reading newspapers and magazines like crazy. So I'm like, hey, that Mel Kiper, man, he's overrated. Let me tell the world about this guy and how he doesn't know actually what's going to happen in the draft, even if he, has his own takes on all the prospects. Or Keith Olbermann is actually not only great on television, he's a brilliant sports writer when he wants to be a writer. I still think Keith could have pretty much done that for his whole life if that was his career track. So yeah, it was just stuff like that. And again, what I knew at the time, weirdly, given my job now, was the media, right? Things about that, because I hadn't been on the campaign trail, I hadn't been in locker rooms, but I had just been a big reader of everything and watcher of stuff.
Was it hard at all to, at that age, on that platform, have some critiques, use your voice when you're talking about people with an aura if you will, in the business, even if it's an author of a book that you're reviewing. That is your job to review the book. But was that a challenge at all? And did you have some hesitations here and there when you're writing some things?
So the big difference between that world and our world is there was no social media to speak of. Twitter had not been invented yet. And so what happened was there was still a lot of power in people who had a byline. Your subjects would write into Slate, and I think Keith actually wrote in and took issue with the way I had characterized his television career in that story that you mentioned. But what had happened was you had a certain, there was a certain just, I don't know what the right word, just gravitas of the press, right? It wasn't like I write an article and then you and all your friends tweet about how terrible I am. That second part just didn't happen at all. And I was also coming up in a world, especially in the kind of opinion magazine, opinion website world that you talk about, where you got your spurs, you earned your spurs by writing stories like that were critical of people. That's just what you did. We throw around the word hit piece a lot like that. And I don't know that I was doing that especially all the time, but that you wrote big critical stories. There was not this kind of I'm going to go write a profile of somebody and it's going to be a great, heartwarming thing about how great they are. I don't think Slate would have published that in most cases. Right. And it's not to say they were looking for negative stuff, but they just wanted stuff that was, thoughtful, critical, had some, here's some good things, here are some not great things. But those are the kind of stories were. And that's just how you made your career. And, now I think it's weirdly given the way everybody talks about how the internet is so evil and mean and social media is so mean, all true, by the way, in its way, people just don't write stories like that as much anymore. If you had a really critical book review, it still happens in the world, but it's not as common, I don't think, at least as it seems to have been in the old days.
I did bookmark one of your stories selfishly. You wrote about Sammy Sosa's corked bat in 2003. And
God, you have to remind me what I wrote.
So the headline was, "Is Sammy lying?" And the subhead is way. And Sammy, who was just welcomed back to Wrigley Field for the first time in 21 years, one of the strangest stories in sports, period, that took that long, weighing the evidence in the corked bat caper. And I selfishly brought this up as a Chicago person who grew up with Sammy, and you kind of went through some evidence about Sammy being in a slump, whatnot. But the other reason I bring that up is I'm going to tell a quick story that hopefully you'll appreciate about this, because it came to mind as I'm reading this. About 4 months or 3.5 months after you wrote that, I was a bat boy for a very important Cubs doubleheader.
Wow.
And they swept the doubleheader and clinched the division that day. And Sammy's bat broke while I was bat boy. And I remember, I'll never forget running on the field thinking oh, my friends are going to think this is so cool that Sammy's bat broke. And I'm thinking do I need to get it quickly? Do I need to race out there just in case? And I'll never forget the umpire just took the 2 shards of bat and threw it at me. And I had to kind of try to catch it and run off. And so when you go back to school the next day and everyone's talking about it, the number one thing was did you look for cork in the bat? What did you think? So thank you for letting me indulge myself in that.
Oh my God,
story.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah, it was an out-of-body experience, but Sammy's bat that day was not corked. But that was a fun one to bring up. I pulled up a few of your stories too, Bryan, from when you got to play, which was the New York Times Magazine section. I think you were 27, I want to say, or around there when you started there. How did that kind of become part of your repertoire and your resume?
So I'd snuck enough sports media stories into Slate, stories I'm sure that very few people at that magazine or the website actually cared about. And then at some point I'd gotten a pop culture column, a weekly column called The Middle Brow, in which I wrote about a number of people that could be considered broadly to be middle brow, like Tom Brokaw or my boss, Bill Simmons, who I actually wrote about as one of the people who knew that I would later be working for Bill, and worked for Bill now for more than a decade. But I had enough of those that when Play, which the editor of Play's name is Mark Bryant, was looking around for, who could write for me, he was told by Franklin Foer, who now's at the Atlantic, and I'd worked with him at the New Republic. He said, there's this guy who is weirdly interested in the way the sports media works. And why don't you talk to him? So we had lunch in Times Square, and I wrote him a big memo of stories and said, here's like 5 ideas that I could do. And I'm pretty sure the Bill column was one of those. And then he hired me. And then I was the media columnist at Play.
The story that I wanted to mention on this podcast is your one from, this is August 20th, 2006, about Tony Cornheiser in the Monday Night Football booth. And I'm going to read you a paragraph because I think it's really fascinating that this was 19 years ago and what the world is today. There are people who would plumb with a B, by the way, Monday Night Football for deep thoughts about American culture. I'm not one of those people, but let me suggest 2 ideas. First, it seems clear the future of ESPN is to merge itself stylistically with sports talk radio. Whereas a few years ago, you could tune in to the ESPN networks with a reasonable hope of finding game broadcasters or sports highlights. Nowadays, the network's dominant feature is a man looking into a camera and relieving himself of an opinion. What began in 1988 with the Sports Reporters, a medium-cool Sunday roundtable of sports writers, has blossomed into Pardon the Interruption, Around the Horn, Cold Pizza, Rome is Burning, and limitless creative avenues for Stephen A. Smith, who is a wallflower like Bill O'Reilly is a wallflower. So that was 19 years ago.
That holds up fairly well.
I was going to say, that aged well. And it's interesting because, going back, talking about, you're writing about Tony Cornheiser, you also had a Bob Costas story early on there. I think it's fascinating how much that lasted to today, but what was it like getting to kind of write for that platform and start really writing about sports media on that level?
First of all, it's just like, you cannot explain how much the New York Times, the pulpit of the New York Times, as people at The Athletic now, I'm sure have observed, just elevates everything. And here's this was a freestanding magazine that came out 4 times a year in the Sunday New York Times. So you just think of like, here's somebody opening their Sunday New York Times. They see the sports magazine with a big athlete on the cover. It's cool. It's glossy. And then, oh my God, here is this media column inside. So just getting so much more attention to what I did was just amazing for me. And I'm writing about Tony. I mean, that's fun. God, that makes me feel so old because I'm thinking, how many Monday night booths have I covered since Tony Cornheiser was on Monday Night Football? But you hear there, it's like, what interested me about that was not just the column idea of, is he going to be good or not, or the profile, like talking to Tony and talking to Will Bond and all those other people that I would have done for that column. But it's just like thinking about the way the world's changing and thinking about back then the way ESPN is changing. And again, at that point, like my brain of, as you said, 2006, is thinking like, ESPN is becoming like this thing I grew up with, sports radio. And now we would just assume that's like, we even forget the tangential connection to sports radio. We're like, that's just ESPN. That is Stephen A. Smith looking into a camera. And by the way, last funny story about that is that when I wrote that sentence, relieving himself of an opinion, I can't remember what the original version was, but I remember the Times style desk that would, swoop in on us from time to time. And tell us about things was just whatever word for aghast you can come up with, that would be the way. Because again, this is a long time ago in newspaper time that people writing something like that was just seen as right, kind of on the line. That line is perfectly tame and not even very good, but it is on the edge of what at the New York Times at the time was considered okay. And I remember we got a note from Style about that one. We had to tone it down somewhat.
Yeah. Curious what your welcome to the big leagues moment was. You mentioned Keith Olbermann writing you after the article at Slate, but did you have a time, whether it was at New Republic or Slate or Play, it could even be at Grantland, where you just had what I do is read by lots of people. People considered this to be, maybe the authority in certain areas. Do you remember some things that kind of stand out as maybe your big leagues moment?
Trying to think. I think the one that made me the happiest and is kind of, sort of speaks to what you're asking is about when I was at Play. Again, there's a lot of freedom there, right? And I was mostly a columnist, but I could write features if I had a good idea. And so I said, hey, my 80-plus-year-old grandfather plays senior softball. And not only play senior softball, he is one of the best, I believe, one of the best senior softball players in the world, at least in the terms of the amount of hardware that he has won. Because he had won multiple world championships. I think it was like 10 or 12 at that point. and he was kind of in this like Pete Rose phase of his career where he was like a player manager. So because he was getting up there, but he could still come in as a pinch runner and a game outfielder. But he was mostly a manager and took his job of managing a senior softball team. He lived in Albuquerque incredibly seriously, like just John McGraw level. You know, Pete himself never cared about the Reds lineup as much as my grandfather did, and they said yeah. And so I went down there, and he was playing a tournament in Arizona, and I went with him and his wife and all these like fantastic guys who were all, 70 to 80 years old, and just watched them play this tournament. They wound up winning the championship of this tournament. And they sent like a very professional New York Times Magazine photographer to take a picture of my grandfather kind of like leaning against the fence, and of my grandmother sitting there watching the games herself. And it was just like, that was just one of the best experience I've ever had in journalism. And I've been thinking about like doing a story about him for a long time, and I didn't want to waste it. Like I wanted to make sure it was someplace where it would get seen, and seeing his reaction was fascinating too, because on the one hand, it was like, hey man, I'm in the New York Times, this is amazing. And on the other hand, he had a reaction like a lot of famous people I write about, which is like, well, of course they'd be writing about me. Like this is, I'm a great senior softball player. I've been waiting for you to call, Curtis. I mean, what took you so long?
That's amazing. The other question I always like to ask is kind of the through line. So if you go back to Bryan Curtis at New Republic or early days at Slate to, let's say, Bryan Curtis today, we'll take, you had that great College Game Day, oral history, some of the things that you've written, or even the work that you do for the podcast. What are some things that you kind of take from those early days of your journalism career that still matter today?
A couple of things. I mean, one is, you mentioned Slate. It was like so formative because they had this great editorial philosophy that would say, hey, magazine profiles where you have a lead, where you see your subject in action, and then you have all these secondary interviews and another scene. And then you have those 3 or 4 paragraphs where you actually tell people what the piece is about. What if we just published those 3 or 4 paragraphs? That's the piece. You don't call the celebrity. You don't, do this. You do a Nexus dump and all that stuff. But like, we just published that, like what you really need to know. That was just like such a great exercise in figuring how to just chop away everything from your writing and think of like, what is interesting? What is arresting about this? What do I have to say about this? Because as you know, you read a lot of magazine profiles. It's like, there's some good stuff in here, but the person just doesn't know what they want to say ultimately. So figure out what you want to say first. That's one. And then I think the second thing is just when you talk about what I do now or the podcast and everything else, it's just working for Jack Schaefer back in the day. I mean, this is a guy who was a purring and occasionally snarling media columnist. He wrote like a dream and still writes like a dream. And, he also he was, when I was young, he would call me up on weekend mornings and just be like, hey, we're going to see Apocalypse Now Redux. I was like, okay. I was 23. I was like, I wasn't sure you could say no, but I was just like, okay. Or he'd be like, 2001's playing in Washington, where I'm going to pick you up in like an hour. I was like, okay. And, what he did is he taught me not just like how to be a journalist, how to think about the media, and particularly just taught me how to like try to be an interesting person and try to be a person who like read about lots of stuff, read books, and how all those things could come into your life and just make you like a fully formed person, and I always think about that now. It's like always, however many like Politico stories I have to read, and Brian Stelter newsletters, and that's all awesome, and all the great Woj bombs that happen within sports media. I'm just like, I want to know about other things. I want to live a life that is happy, because I just think that makes you better at your job in ways that aren't obvious. And I learned that from Jack. That I'll never ever be able to repay him for all that he taught me, but especially maybe that.
As somebody who, again, you host a podcast about the media. You talk a lot about sports media on there as well. I'm sure you get young people all the time who reach out to you and ask you about the industry, and so much has changed. What today would be your advice to somebody who wants to break in?
I always say that 2 things. One is that I don't know that it's ever been a good time to get into journalism. I don't know that everybody's like, hey, come on in. We got tons of jobs, high pay, great benefits. That's never been the case in my career, even if it certainly got worse now. And I remember my mom was a high school counselor, and she had a hilarious like list of starting level salaries. in various industries. And when I started talking about being a journalist in elementary school, like at some point she showed me this list, and it was like, attorney, astronaut, lumberjack, and then eventually you got to journalist. And I remember at the time it was like $18,000 a year. I was like, wow, that sounds like a lot of money. So she didn't dissuade me. But so one thing is I tell them, like, as bad as it is now, and it has certainly gotten worse over the last 25 years, it was never exactly a good time. And the people that got into the industry and made it in the industry were the people just had to be here. Like, there was no part of your being that could imagine doing any other job. You could have gone and been a great attorney or great at anything else, but part of your soul would have said, like, I wish I was doing that. That's where I belong in this world. And then practically what I tell them is you have to learn how to do everything now. Learning how to write a gamer is a cool thing, but it's also, you need to know how to host a podcast. You need to know how to produce a podcast, because that might actually be a much better entryway into the world. You have to be able to write a feature. You have to be able to understand social media and everything else, and video and everything else. Like, I would just tell them that the toolkit that people like you and I came in with has got to be so much bigger now, because, again, part of it is staying in the business, but part of it's starting in the business. What's that first job going to be? And then I think the third thing is just ideas. Like, people that last and people that do well as young people have lots of ideas. That's what they come in with. It's like, and maybe it's not an idea for something they're going to do. So, they're not going to write, Frank Sinatra has a cold tomorrow, but it's an idea to help somebody else's podcast that they work with. Like, here's a great idea for a segment. Why don't you try this? Why don't you do that? So I just tell them all the time, like, that's what you should be doing. Just reading a ton, watching everything you can, and just trying to come up with as many good ideas as you can to get people to notice you.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about your boss for a second in that realm in terms of Bill Simmons, because, Bill is one of one. And when he was doing what he was doing, nobody was doing it. Nobody was obviously doing it at his level. And even in reading some of your stuff too, you weren't like breaking news in 2001. You don't even need to do the
air quotes, by the way, for that one. No.
And because I think so much of our industry, like if you're a young person, you're like, oh, I need to learn how to break news like that person, or I need to have like a voice like this person. But like, I wonder if is there still room for someone who just writes and has a voice that is unique and finds that way to do it? And I'd like to say the answer is yes. We'll always find room for that. But the person, obviously, you have to be able to do other things to amplify and to platform that stuff. But just again, like the uniqueness of what Bill had, and people from the early 2000s who weren't dropping Woj bombs or weren't being Stephen A. Like, is there still room for someone to do that as long as they can do the other stuff too?
I think the place you see that most clearly is in podcasting, because the kind of people who host podcasts that are really great oftentimes tend to be people that are just what we're describing. They got a great voice. They got great ideas. They're actually very secretly nerdy behind the scenes. I would say that about almost everybody who's been successful in this business, up to including Dan Jenkins, by the way, who was, a cigarette smoking, scotch sipping, coolest guy on earth. But when you actually talk to him, he could tell you the names of every single Heisman winner ever. And he could also tell you the names of everybody who he thought should have won the Heisman that year. Like, he had that, or just every golf major winner ever. Like, he had that just crazy amount of nerdy sports knowledge behind it. So when you're talking like, who's that person, is that going to exist in print? I hope so too. And I think probably it can, but it certainly exists in podcasting. That's just what that is, right? That's that, hey, it's that unique person, and they're like, I just want to hear what they have to say about this, because they're interesting and they're different, and they don't always say what I expect them to say. And the whole breaking news thing, air quotes or not, I'm like, first of all, we don't need to get into like a bogus press box segment here, but the news that gets broken in sports is often not news. It's something that's going to happen anyway, and you're announcing something that everybody's going to know about in an hour. But as purely from a careerist perspective, okay, Jeff Passan's got part of this on lockdown, or Kenny Rosenthal. Shams has got this on lockdown. Schefter. What are you going to do? Like, what if if you want to be the Shams guy who replaces the guy, then that's great. But how many people are going to be able to do that? Like, the whole insight of insider the insider era is that one person is breaking all the news in all the individual cities, right? I don't need to tell you this on the Bears beat, right? Like it's hard, it's freaking hard. Like that, they've kind of replaced everybody else, or at least that capability of everybody else. So the whole thing to me, if you're not going to be that guy, if you're not going to defeat Darth Vader, then what I would say is you have to figure out something else. You gotta figure out a way to stay this, and being able to think of things and have great ideas. And to me, when I listen to podcasts, like the immediate thing you think is like, are these people just saying like, here's the thing that happened in the news? Or do they really have an idea? Do they really have that historical knowledge, wide-ranging knowledge that they can bring to it and help you understand it? Like, man, I didn't think of it that way. Or I didn't know that this had actually happened 20 years before in slightly different form. That, to me, are the people that distinguish themselves.
Yeah, and back to your point about nerds, I should let you know that you are talking to a two-time Northwestern sports trivia champion.
See, there we go.
So
isn't it really the secret of everybody in the business? I know that most of us actually project that way. We don't actually have the veneer of Dan Jenkins, but I'm just like, whenever I meet anybody, that's like the thing that comes out. It could be it's the person that is suave on a podcast or as suave on the page as you could imagine, and then you start talking, you're like, oh, you're like me. Right?
Yeah.
That is the thing we all, I think, have in common.
Listeners will remember I had Tyler Kepner on a little bit ago, and we talked about the Immaculate Grid game, where you're matching players to the things, and he has like ridiculous scores, and I have text threads with fellow journalists in which we try to remember a guy, essentially, who can do the best job remembering a guy, and sometimes credit to, I believe, David Roth with that,
yes.
But so much of what we do is who can remember a guy best, and then the next part is writing about that guy.
Yes,
and
Tyler, by the way, I had no doubt that he was actually like that in real life. So
yes.
It's not a surprise to me.
Not at all. Hey, Bryan, to break down the fourth wall, I really appreciated the consult you gave me before I started this podcast, because I look up to you and your writing and listen to the press box and think you guys do a wonderful job. As I joked with you before I said consult, I called you the foremost expert in these podcasts. So, you know what? I think what we're going to do here, I want to build, you hear about the Bill Parcells coaching tree. Let's have a Bryan Curtis podcast tree that we can start. Maybe they'll tentacle off the Bill Simmons tree to get there. So I'm going to work hard to make this podcast part of it. But obviously, I appreciated the advice. And look, hey, podcast is still going. So.
First of all, congratulations to you. You've had fantastic guests on here, and I love hearing all these origin stories because they're all different, right? Yep. And none of them. The funny thing is like, I think when young people get in the business, you're like, okay, how do I replicate that? And it turns out that almost no one's is replicable. And even before the world changed and, covering preps at a newspaper or fact checking a magazine went away. Like, it's just, you learn the takeaway to me, and it's part of what you're exploring is like, it's all different. Joe Davis is different, right? Everybody has this strange thing that you could never replicate, but they're all so fascinating because they've made them into the people that they are.
And sadly, a lot of at least for writers, a lot of the places where we started don't exist anymore. So,
God.
But it's part of it. It's part of all of the journeys, and I will say you are the first guest who started at New Republic. So, because I've had a few,
probably the last.
Yeah.
Let's be honest.
But as you said, it's all, everyone's got their own unique path, and that's what's been a lot of fun about this podcast. So, Bryan, thank you for joining me and telling our listeners how you broke in, and everyone should go listen to the press box.
Thank you, Kevin. It's just been an honor.